All right, I don't have a very long message. I'll relieve your fears right now. You're like, oh, I gotta be here at midnight now. Alrighty. So we are in the year of the quest. All right, who knows? It's the quest to, thank you. The year of the quest. There are 3 quests run. One is the quest to know God, the quest to, oh, no, you're ahead of me yet. The quest to serve God and the quest to follow God, okay? And we just went through a whole series on how God reveals himself to us. This is so we can know God and we can follow God. And we said that God's revelation is always so that we might. All right, yay, there you go. There's the belief. So God's revelation is always so that we might believe. God reveals himself for that single and full purpose so that we know that he is real, that he is true, that he is God. And we went through, God reveals himself through angels, or we called them agents, through creation. He reveals himself through prophets and prophecies, dreams and visions. I should be quizzing you guys. And I said that we went through the word, part 1 and part 2. God reveals himself to us through the word, the written word, the Bible, through the scriptures. And then last week, we talked about how God reveals himself through the word, but this time the word, the flesh, Jesus Christ, his son. And so we're going to expand a little further on that. John chapter 14, Jesus has this conversation with Philip and Thomas, and he says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And so these are just powerful words. You have to remember, imagine if one of us stood up here and said, hey, if you look at me, you see God. Well, this is an interesting concept. But these are powerful words that come from a man, but not just an ordinary man. I mean, this is Jesus Christ. He is the anointed one. He's the Son of God. He is God in the flesh. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. And so these words that Jesus says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father, they are an invitation. They invite us. They challenge us. They say, look at me. And when you do, you are going to see him. Now, I'll tell you what. I try to live my life as best as I can, I try to do the right things, either in front of people and behind people. And sometimes, you get those morally challenging moments, like somebody gave you too much money back at the store, and you're like, okay, and you give it back, right? So I try to live my life as best as I can, but I don't think I would give an open invitation to everybody who is there and everybody from then on in the whole world to come and look at my life and say, hey, you're going to see God as my life. But so Jesus does this. I mean, would you want somebody probing into every area of your life? Of course not, right? No, we wouldn't. I mean, sometimes things can be pretty on the outside even, but boy, you might go deep in my heart. I don't know if I want anybody probing around in there because, there's some ugly stuff in there. So it's a downright scary trip in there, pride, selfishness, arrogance. I mean, what about our temptations that, maybe we struggle with on the inside and nobody ever sees, but Jesus hands us this invitation, this challenge. He says, come, look at me. You see, Jesus has nothing to hide. This verse is really about as bold as you can get. He invites his disciples. He invites the religious establishment of the day. He invites you, and he invites me to look in and to look at him and to stare at him intently, because when we do, what we'll see is the Father. That's pretty bold, isn't it? It's pretty radical to say something like that. The writer of Hebrews says it like this. It's Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. It says, the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. In the Greek, they use this word, the very image of his substance. So he is the exact representation of his being, the very image of God's substance. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So this word for the very image is a Greek word. It's karakter. And I probably did not say it that well. But it's karakter. And karakter means graver. Engraver is a person who engraves, or it could be the tool that they use for engraving is also a graver. So it could be the person or the tool that is used for engraving. And I love this deep thought because that Jesus is who God is, then he is the person who shapes us and changes us, right? He is the graver. He leaves a permanent impression on our lives. He changes us. And I said last week that Jesus is the mold. I said he is the exact representation of God. And if you want to make a copy of something that is, let's say, multi-dimensional, okay? If you want to make a copy of something that's multi-dimensional, like God, you would have to make what? You would have to make a mold. And Jesus is the mold of God. And that fits into that Greek word karakter, because doesn't a mold leave an impression on what goes into it? You see, Jesus is the mold of God. And when we pour into him, what comes out looking like God. Now, I spent some time making a mold this week. You know, this is how we have all of those chains of armor out there because, you know, I had to learn how to be a chain mailer because God was speaking to me about chain mail. Well, God was speaking to me about this concept about Jesus being the mold, and so I felt like I just need to learn how to make a mold. Now, I've filled molds before, but I've never actually made a mold before. Thank you, Google. So I found this way of making a mold with silicone. And basically, for me to understand this, I'm a hands-on person. I have got to get my hands into it, and I know when my hands are into it that God is going to speak to me. So you take, you've seen those tubes of silicone that, you put around your tub to keep the water from going in? Okay. So you take those tubes of silicone, and you squirt an entire tube into a bucket of water that has like Dawn dish detergent in it, okay? And so you squeeze it into the water, and it starts to get into a little ball, and then you have to knead it, and you pull it out, and it's messy, and it's kind of sticky, and you just kind of like go around with it, and you just kind of knead it until it starts to get all mixed together, and then you mold what it is that you want to mold, right? So the lady on YouTube made it flat, and she put chocolate chips because she was making a chocolate chip mold. I don't know why, but it seems like that's a lot of work for some chocolate chips. But so she made some chocolate chip molds, and so I really felt compelled. You guys are gonna think I'm crazy that I molded this. So I felt compelled to actually go out to the store and buy a little plastic baby because I felt compelled to mold a little baby. And so I've got this silicone in one hand, and I've got this too, and I've got the baby in the other hand. And if you can imagine putting the baby in this and wrapping it around it, and I just had this overwhelming feeling just about how God, if you can imagine, wrapping himself in the flesh and making a mold of himself and sending it here to earth so that we might know how to live in the flesh with this mold, how to live as human beings, how to be what God would desire us to be. And as we endeavor to fill this mold, to examine it, to press our lives into it, somehow we come out being a representation of God, looking like God. Romans 8:29 says we are to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. And isn't that beautiful when you think about that? And so here I am. Now, you'll find I don't have it here today, okay? What I have found is that silicone takes a really long time to dry. And so I made it a couple days ago, and it's still really wet. So I'm figuring this is why it took God so long to send Jesus, because he was waiting for the mold to dry, because I'm still waiting for that mold to dry. But I will probably have it here, next week. We don't have service, but probably the next week. And I know that God is going to teach me something about when I pull this baby out of this mold and I look inside it. But anyways, that's why I don't have it here, because I know you're all like, where's the mold? But it's at home, still drying. But when we fill this mold that Jesus is, then we do come out being a representation of God. That's the whole idea. That's why God sent an exact representation of who he is. And the Bible describes it as being a light in this dark world. When we fill this mold of God, when we yield to the graver, when we yield to who Jesus is in our lives, when we let him shape us and direct us, somehow we come out looking something like God. I mean, not that we are God. That's not the same thing. This is a representation, right? The mold never makes the original, right? So we're not God. But somehow we are conformed to his likeness. So it is our duty as Christians to examine this mold that God has sent for us, this mold that Christ is. Jesus invites us to do that when he says, when you look at me, you see the Father. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing over these next few series of messages. So sort of my message today is an introduction for the other messages. But if we get this concept that Jesus is the mold, it kind of gives us a direction and a purpose to what we need to be doing now. You see, as we examine this mold of who Jesus is, but with intent, not like, oh, this is who Jesus was as an historical figure or whatever. No, this is the mold of God. And we're going to study it with intent and with understanding on what it is that we need to do to fill this mold. And so I have 4 parts of the mold that we're going to study. The first part is his hands. We're going to study the hands of Jesus. I call this the mold of servitude. We examine, Jesus said that the greatest shall be the servant of all. Why did he say that? What did Jesus show us as the mold of his hands in relationship to serving others and how we are supposed to be and how we are going to fill that mold in this world? The second thing we're going to study is his feet. And I call this the mold of humility. Here we're going to study where Jesus has walked, where he went. Where does the King of Kings spend his time? And then we're going to study his head. I call this the mold of righteousness. We will examine the mind of Christ. What was he thinking? Who was he thinking about? What was he saying? What did his eyes see? How did he hear from the Father? This is the mold of his head. This is the mold of righteousness. And then we are going to examine his body, which I call the mold of sonship. See, Jesus shows us quite clearly how to live as sons and daughters of God. And that's what we're going to study. How do we become a child of God? How do we live as a child of God? How do we live as his son, as his daughter, as his prince, as his princess? How do we live as those things? And Jesus is the mold that we're going to fill. And when we look at his body, that's what we're going to learn. And so I invite you to join us. Join us in the process of examining this mold. Who is Jesus? Who is this God in this flesh, this God that shows us how to live, this exact representation of God? Like I said, God's revelation is always that we might believe. And so he sends Jesus here, this exact representation of himself, so that we would know who he is. And so we are going to examine it. But examining the mold of Christ is just one thing. It's one thing to know the mold. It's one thing to become familiar with the mold. It's a whole other thing to submit to the mold, to submit to the graver. You see, it's our decision to fill up this mold. Molds are poured into. They are pressed into. You can be covered with a mold. Do you ever make chocolate molds? Right? So you pour into them. What do you got to do after you pour into them? What? You get the chocolate in, but then what do? You pour into it. What's a very important step to make sure this mold turns out okay? What? No? Yes. Say it nice and loud. You got to shake it. That's right. You got to shake it to get all of the air out, to get everything that's impure out of there. You see, and when we fill that mold, trust me, there's going to be some shaking in our lives, but it's a good thing because it's going to pull those things out to the surface so we can be more of a pure mold, a true mold to who Jesus was and is in our lives. So will you let God do this? Will you let him pour you in to this mold of Jesus? Will you let him press you in? Will you let him cover you with this mold of Jesus and who he is, with his hands, his feet, his head, his body? Will you let him shake you up? Because that's what the next messages are going to be about. Us filling the mold of Jesus. And if you are willing, you will see the radiance of the glory of God in your life, like Hebrews 1:3 says, the image of his substance. You see, one day, you and me, we're going to pop out of this mold, all right? And we're going to find ourselves face to face with God, right? Looking in heaven's mirror. And hopefully, we see a representation of God himself. Hopefully, what we see is God's glory. And we see the shape of the graver, Jesus, the one who is the mold for us to follow. And maybe we resemble something that looks like Jesus. But until then, hopefully people around us will see that as well. Because that's the whole idea. Jesus is the revelation of God, the complete and full revelation of God. And the more we fill into his mold, the more we pour our lives into him, the more we come looking out like him. You see, sooner or later, we'll see what we poured into. You see, because you are what you pour into. See, one day, when we do look in heaven's mirror, we'll see everything we've poured into. I don't know. I think I'm going to be some sort of mishmashy thing. I hope I'm a little more Jesus than any of those other things. But, that's my goal. To be as much like Jesus as I can, but I'm not perfect and you're not perfect either, and so Jesus takes up the difference, right? That was the work on the cross, but that's no excuse for not trying to fill the mold as best as we can now. So here's our key message. When we look at Jesus, we see the Father, and when we yield to Jesus, we see the image of the Father in us. Amen?